And today we're looking at the book of Job, where we're attempting to just kind of see what's God's relation when it comes to suffering and what we go through in life, which is seasons of pain. One of my jobs here as a pastor is to take you through the book of Job. Okay. But my main goal for that is to prepare you for the day of suffering. And one of the things that I love about this book is that to prepare people like me, to prepare you for suffering, means that God has to sometimes take me through seasons upon seasons of suffering. And many of you know my story. If anything you could really think of when it comes to my story, as I was going through this book, there was a time when I just stopped. And I just began to really just like lash out at God in anger, because I look at this as I'm seeing Job being hit by wave after wave of suffering. And I just began to say, God, what's the point in all this? But God started showing me, even through this week, how through every single time and every single portion of my life, I remember like for 20 years, in fact, as far as I remember, 1987, I was born in 1985, 1987, my mother sends us to our rural areas to go live with our grandparents because she cannot take care of us, and we were dirt poor, and then she is sick almost every time. 1992, she brings us back, and we watch her almost dying. From there onwards begins an 8-year journey of watching her become a living skeleton on the bed. And literally, I remember standing right at the edge of the bed. I remember getting so close to her, wanting to see whether she was still breathing, because she was flat on the bed as a living skeleton. And shortly after that, she passed. And this pain took me, buried me under depression and pain and all that. Found myself standing on top of a building trying to take my own life. And out of that, the man of sorrows, who's acquainted with all grief, Jesus, came and stood by me, where a cousin came and told me that he couldn't understand how I felt, but he knew somebody who had gone through worse pain, introduced me to Jesus on the spot, and that changed my life. And I remember just from that moment onwards, I remember saying, if there is an answer in Jesus that is this satisfying, how come a lot of people don't know about this? And that became the birth of me, giving my life to a life of ministry, where from that day onwards I began to tell everyone about the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he was able to heal us from the deepest wounds that we could ever experience. And I remember from that time onwards, that really just became my life, to preach the gospel. And when things were when I thought everything was over, I remember 2005 and giving my life to the missionary life with Youth with a Mission. And during that same time, that's when we got the news. My sister had gotten 3 strokes in Joburg, South Africa. 24 years old, loved her with everything, the only girl that we had in our lives. And I remember having to calculate, what should I do? Didn't have a visa, didn't have anything. I remember one of our church members having to offer me to take me across the border illegally. And I remember being smuggled through the border to walk into a hospital and see the only girl that I had ever loved at that moment. She was in the bed, and she ran and she hugged me. And I remember that began an excruciating journey of watching her go through the same cycles my mother went through. And we were in Zimbabwe at that moment, and I am serving God with everything possible. And I remember at one point, I am actually praying and crying to God and saying, God, why don't you just take her? Because this is unfair. This is painful. But I remember during that time, this was the time when I remember my church getting around me. And I remember the Church of Jesus Christ coming, loving upon loving, serving us and doing everything possible. And I remember them coming. Her funeral lasted for 5 days. That's how we do it in Africa, 5 days. And I remember people coming to know Jesus through her story, because in her deathbed, that even launched me even more into preaching the gospel. Because in her deathbed, I remember a living skeleton on the bed with eyes, with her body deteriorated so much, but with so much hope in her eyes, and telling me that she wasn't worried because she knew Jesus. And that changed everything. I remember from there leaving and going a week after, going to Mozambique. And I remember for that year, this is 2006, it's 2006. And I remember sitting in front of the ocean over and over with my guitar, weeping and singing worship songs as God was healing my heart. And I thought that was over. And some of you know that this year, I remember it was a Wednesday. As I was here in the office, got a FaceTime call, looked at my father. The week before that, he had said, "Son, are you going to come? I'm going to die without seeing you." And I remember that Wednesday as I was looking, and they say, "Son, listen, you need to talk to him." I remember trying to talk to him. His eyes were shut, and his body so deteriorated. He just opened his eyes. I began to talk to him. And that was the time when they said, "Listen, this is it." And I remember we had just booked the tickets to try to go there. I remember dropping on my knees, saying, "God, what is going on?" And I remember just trying to be normal around, and the office is operating, everybody's walking around. I remember weeping so loud, but burying myself in the couch and just trying to make sense of what is going on. And even in the midst of that, I remember God met me. It was so amazing. And so watching the grace of God take my whole family, go to Africa. And when I got there, I saw the love of God through everything. But not only that, through this, I got to see my father on the last days, got to celebrate looking back 20 years, that the first death rescued me from my own death because I was introduced to Jesus, that the second death propelled me more into ministry, but my father's death reconciled a lot of anger that I had in my heart, because my father, when I look back, we were reconciling over and over and over. What's the point of suffering, you may ask? I may say that today you get to, if you enjoy and you get to enjoy my life in your life, and I want to say that you're probably enjoying the fruits of suffering. Because in suffering, God has drawn me closer and closer. In suffering, God has showed so much more of His glory. In suffering, I remember in college, trying to get education, crying before God and say, "God, why is it that I don't have parents that are alive to take care of me?" Every semester, walked into the dean's office and they told me, "We're going to have to send you back home because you can't pay." But I remember standing on that podium, being the speaker of that class, saying that God kept the promise. He said He paid in full for me at the cross. Today I get to watch Him pay my school fees in full. But I want to say this. This is what Timothy Keller says. No matter what precautions we take as people, no matter how well we have put together a good life, no matter how hard we have worked to be healthy, wealthy, and comfortable with friends and family and successful in our career, something will inevitably ruin it. No amount of money and power and planning can prevent bereavement, dire illness, relationship betrayal, financial disasters, and a host of other troubles from entering your life. And he's going to say human life is fatally fragile and subject to forces beyond our power to manage. Life is tragic. So as we open the book of Job this morning, I just want us to really just to begin to think about this issue of suffering. Most of the suffering that comes our way, like Job's, will come from nowhere, but it will not be connected. A lot of times it will not be connected to your character, but it will develop it further.